Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Warburg Institute. I am Bill Sherman, the Institute's director, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to our new auditorium for the latest in a series of book events organized in association with Penguin, with our friends in publishing. Now, today it's a huge privilege to launch Life in Progress, the new memoir of Hans Ulrich Obrist, whom you will all know as the artistic director of the Serpentine, and what Penguin's press release described as the art world's most inventive connector. An interesting way to put it. Now, it's certainly true, but I don't think it comes anywhere near capturing the curated cosmos that Hans has created. The bio takes us further. He says that he has staged more than 300 shows, visited more than 4,600 artist studios, contributed to over 300 books. But I think anyone who knows him would say that it's the work he does behind the scenes that doesn't have numbers attached to it. Nurturing, organizing, promoting, documenting, dreaming, and indeed connecting. That's so impossibly generative that I cannot be the only person to wonder if there's a secret twin or even triplet allowing him to be in 2 or 3 places at once. We at the Warburg have benefited on countless occasions from Hans's support, his inimitable connectedness. And I myself receive a steady stream of messages introducing me always to someone wonderful and almost uncannily relevant, always prefaced with the legendary phrase, "It's urgent." Sometimes just, if it's really urgent, it's just urgent. Sometimes very urgent even. So what a pleasure it is to have the chance to thank him in person here and to talk about his amazing life and work. Though I have to confess that the idea of being in conversation with the world's greatest conversationalist is daunting, but it also feels, especially because the book itself, it's the first time I've launched a book in conversation with the author where the author has a section about how to do conversations with other people, but I ignored it. But it also feels totally natural for 2 reasons. One is, as Hans will remember, this room that we're in is the new auditorium of the Warburg, launched 1 year ago as part of a complete renewal of our historic building. And the very, very first public event we did in this space was in fact organized with the Serpentine around a book launch featuring the poetry of one of the many great artists Hans Ulrich has introduced us to, and indeed to the Warburg, Precious Okoyama. So I thank you for coming full circle and now coming yourself. But the other thing that's quite important is, as we learn in the book, and as Hans has told me from the very first meeting we had about 8 years ago here, there are direct connections between Hans Ulrich Obrist and A.B. Warburg. And that seems like the best place to start. And so I wonder, Hans, if you'd be willing just to read the section in the early chapters about your formative encounter with the ghost of Warburg.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you all for being here. And before reading this fragment, I want to thank so much, of course, also the publisher Penguin. It's been an amazing experience once more. It's, I think, our 5th book together, and I want to thank Stephen McGrath and Denise Rose Hansen and Kasiana Yonita and Annabella Huxley, and of course the translator, David Watson. And it's been a very interesting process also in terms of translation, because in a way, the book actually was first written in French, because I basically was commissioned by Bernard Comment, by Le Seuil in France, and it was written during the lockdown. And he rang me every morning at 8 a.m., you know, and he said, "Have you written?" So after about a week, I felt really guilty and I started to write. So that's kind of how it began. It was also the first time I wrote the book in French. And in a long time, because I used to live there in the 90s and early 2000s, but I hadn't written in French. And it's interesting because I tried to write it initially in German and it sounded wrong. And then I tried to write it in English and it didn't work. And then it was very strange, because then the book got translated into my mother tongue from French. And that happened, you know, when basically it was translated last summer. And then it was translated brilliantly by David Watson. I'm really grateful for this incredible translation. But I suddenly felt it was too long. And so then I kind of spent the whole summer editing pages out and really compressing it and making it denser. So it's about 30% basically reduced from what, you know, the original book was. And it's kind of almost like a totally different book now. So it's than it was actually when I wrote it. So in a way, it's been a very fascinating process, and I'm so grateful to Penguin. And of course, so grateful to you, because it's a dream that this can happen and that we can be here at the Warburg Institute, because Warburg is really the reason why I became a curator and a museum director. It sort of all began with Abi Warburg, and that's what this fragment is going to be about. In Kreuzlingen, on the way to my school, there was a sort of haunted house, which I was never brave enough to enter. It was abandoned and a bit scary, but one day I asked one of my teachers, I must have been 14 or 15 at the time, if he knew anything about this house, about its history. It turned out that he was actually quite familiar with it. It was the former clinic of Dr. Ludwig Binswanger. Binswanger was a Swiss psychiatrist, a pioneer in existential psychology, and also the subject of Michel Foucault's thesis. He was a reader of Jung, but also of Husserl and of Heidegger. He had run this clinic, the Bellevue Sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, between 1911 and 1956, and took an anthropological approach to his subjects. And one of his most famous patients was Abi Warburg. The son of a Jewish banker in Hamburg, Warburg was meant to take up the reins of the family business, but obtained his family's dispensation to devote himself to his passion for art, history, and books. He left the bank to his brothers and arranged to be paid an annuity that allowed him to continue his research and build up his unique library, which has since become so well known. It is him we are to thank for the fabulous Mnemosyne Atlas, an atlas composed of about 40 black glass panels on which he attached hundreds of different images, postcards, photographs, pictures from magazines, ranging from antiquity to more contemporary art. The just past, as Walter Benjamin would have called it. My teacher told me about all this in his reply to my slightly anxious question. He explained to me the connections between memory, astrology, mythology, archaeology, migrations, Dionysus, the Muses, Dürer, and so on. This library, founded by Warburg in Hamburg, was then relocated by the negative force of history a few years after his death to London, escaping destruction by the Nazis. All of this invoked in me a kind of dream, a very powerful fantasy of creating one day such a library myself. My teacher also told me that day that Warburg had psychotic episodes of acute paranoia, and so came to Binswanger's clinic in Kreuzlingen for treatment. While there, he wrote a lecture that later became a book, The Snake Ritual, about the culture and rituals of the Hopi community, and he showed his research to the nursing staff and patients at the clinic. This was a beautiful story which made a big impression on me because I saw it as an experiment in care through rituals of healing. I bought those of Warburg's books that were available and added them to the pile that was already taking over my parents' apartment. They were afraid that they would soon run out of space. It has always been a major concern in my life to make room for my books.
Amazing, amazing. And I think what's really wonderful, aside from obviously placing us both here in this room, which is the space that holds the ark, that holds that library, exiled from Hamburg, it really touches on so many of the questions that run through the whole book, but it also, in a way, it shows how the press release's description as a coming-of-age memoir, it's a very English-sounding phrase, for me doesn't quite capture what I think in German would be Bildungs or Bildungsroman in some way. It's an account of the formation, intellectual, educational, etc. And also, of course, Bildung has Bild as image right at the very beginning. And so it's really wonderful. But there's so many formative themes or topics that come up right away. So the very first one, of course, is books and libraries. And for someone who has done so much with the visual arts, with museums, with galleries, I was very surprised, even knowing you, how formative libraries were rather than museums. And I wonder if you want to say a little bit about the importance of books and libraries in your own Bildung.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because my parents never really took me to museums, so that was all self-discovered later on. But my parents did take me to the famous monastery library in St. Gallen when I was a child. And I think that was a very formative experience because it's an incredibly important library in St. Gallen. It burned down, but then was rebuilt during the time of the Rococo. And it includes the famous St. Gallen cloister plan from the 10th, 11th century, and a lot of, really important medieval codexes. And so I remember I was kind of like maybe 7 or 8 years old, and we were in this library. I had to wear these felt shoes, to walk
like
silently,
yeah.
and could make an appointment and then get gloves and really touch these medieval books and look at them and then sort of time travel. And I think it's important. I always ask artists also, what's the first museum they have visited? I do think it's a really incredibly important thing. What's the first kind of experience? And then, I mean, ever since, books have been a very important part of my life. And also, I just think, when artists do books, very often it's artist books. So it's also an extension of the exhibition and all of that. And I buy a book every day. I have a kind of a ritual. And I mean, it's interesting in terms of Warburg, because soon after this experience, of the teacher telling me what it was, I obviously, I was 14 or 15, so I didn't fully comprehend the complexity of, the pathos form. I didn't fully understand the complexity of what Warburg meant, but I did understand that he somehow combined images on these boards, and that was a form of, curation. And I started to buy a lot of postcards, and hundreds and hundreds of postcards of artworks, and build my own panels in my room. And then at a certain moment, I then started to build boxes and make fictitious exhibitions. So when I was like 15, I was curating exhibitions. So it was really very directly related to Abi Warburg. And then, of course, somehow I had forgotten about this. And then when I was like 17, I started to make studio visits. And of course, I mean, books, it's also a way how art came to me, because my parents, wouldn't go to museums. Art arrived in our household, and we didn't have any art books. It arrived through very unexpected channels. So, for example, I mean, it was the analog age, prior to the internet. So the most important book of my childhood was the timetable of the Swiss railway. Because, every year one would get this thick book. I'm sure it existed here in the UK as well. It's a very thick book of all the railway connections in Switzerland and then also Europe. Night trains, a lot of night trains. And I was really, so from 12 onwards, looking at this book every day, starting to plan fictitious journeys. And I started to obsessively learn languages. I learned Russian and Spanish and Italian, French, English, to get ready for the trip, to basically get ready to leave. I think it's also a kind of a small country syndrome. When you grow up in a small country, you get ready, for leaving, because there are no big cities. And on the cover of this book, of this most important book of my childhood, there was always also an artwork, because the Swiss railway system commissioned an artwork. And they commissioned, I think in 85, when I was 17, they commissioned Claude Sando, who is a Swiss artist from Lucerne. They commissioned him to do the cover. And I looked at this every day, and then I heard that he had an exhibition, so I asked my parents if we could go and see it. And I was so fascinated that I wrote him a fan letter, and that became then, the first studio visits. But I think, and that's the kind of interesting thing, writing the book, is that I had completely forgotten about this whole thing, about how important that timetable of the railway system was, but also how important it simply was, how actually art came to me. And I think that was a major inspiration later, when I then became a curator and started to organize shows, to actually go with art into society, because I was aware that for so many more kids who grew up in households where the parents wouldn't take them to museums, unless we go with art to them, they would never have these encounters. For example, also art arrived in our household because the famous Swiss artist Jean Tinguely, Switzerland would use his images on the chocolate. So I would, use the chocolate paper,
tins,
exactly, the tins, and put it on the wall and in my room. Or the Swiss healer Emma Kunz is an artist who was also a healer. Her powder, my mother bought always in the pharmacy. There was a little drawing of Emma Kunz on it, so I was also looking at that. So in a way, curatorially, I also think it's important to disseminate exhibitions into the world through different ways. And today, of course, also digitally.
You've touched on something I was going to pick up on, which again links you with Warburg, and it's really the idea first that it isn't just Kunst, it isn't just art, it's Bild. It's actually from any source, including industrial or commercial contexts, things that you could afford, things that you could have for free even and collect and display yourself. But it was also interesting to read that I felt that there was an affinity because your curatorial work goes beyond what is normal boundaries, I'd say, around roles in those transactions. Warburg is often talked about as less an art historian than an artist or a curator. And in some ways, I think, as well as blurring the boundaries between art, fine art, and image, the homemade Bilder Atlas and home displayed Bilder Atlas for you, I think also shows that unusual combination, very active combination to cross those boundaries.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because
Yeah.
obviously it's beautiful how in the Mnemosyne Atlas there is also Werbeplakate, ads are in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Stamps are in it.
Yeah.
All of these are kind of Bedeutungsträger, kind of carriers of meaning of some sort.
Right.
For,
He called them Bilderfahrzeug.
yeah, for vehicles.
Vehicles for the
Yeah.
movement of images.
Or vectors, maybe. Yeah,
Also
vehicles and
vectors, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously then, a few years later, 3-4 years later, as I mentioned, I started to make these studio visits. And initially I did them in Switzerland. And then I started to realize, I really needed to take these night trains I had imagined during my childhood. And I bought these tickets, which you could basically, as an adolescent for 1 month, for almost no money, travel all week.
You're less than 17.
Yeah, 16, 17. And so I would take these night trains all over Europe. I mean, initially...
you have to read it with the eyes of his parents, because there's so many moments where you apologize retroactively for the extraordinary trust that they had to place in you.
Yeah, initially they were like super worried, and so they actually traveled with me, for a couple of times. But then they sort of, at the same moment, realized that they had also, it just wouldn't work. So then they had to let me go.
They had to wait out in the rain once, and that was enough. They decided to just leave.
Yeah, there was this terrible story with Louis Bourgeois, because I then went for the first time to New York when I was like 18, 19 or something. And then I went to see Louis Bourgeois. And obviously I had no apartment of my own. There was no cell phone. So I gave her the telephone number and the address of my parents. Then about a week later, she called, and I was still traveling in the US. And she kind of spoke to my mother. She said, I'm really, really worried. Your son came to see me. He's all alone in New York. He had a cold. So then I completely freaked out, But then I would go to Cologne, and it was really interesting. That was the first visit with Gerhard Richter, because I became very obsessed by the work of Gerhard Richter. And he became obviously a mentor to me. We became friends, and that friendship has been going on now for, almost 40 years. And during that first visit with Gerhard Richter, he told me about his atlas. And of course, Richter's atlas is completely related to Avi Warburg. He has this amazing, image atlas where he combines all kinds of images, snapshots, studio shots, all kinds of images, overpainted photographs, things related, research material for his work, the atlas, which is now in the Lehmbach House in Munich, and he still continues to send materials, plates, additional plates.
Yes, it's more than 800 tafel panels so far. We'll come back to...
So our road always seemed to lead to Warburg.
Yeah, well, many. Let's come back to Richter and to studio visits in a minute. There were one or two other things in that opening passage that I really found extraordinary and intuitive. One of them is the way in which you talk about a kind of therapeutic or healing context for Warburg's work. It's an extraordinary essay if you haven't read it, the so-called Lecture on the Serpent Ritual. And it was a centenary 2 years ago. It was written in 1923 as his sanity test to get out of the asylum. Extraordinary text, extraordinary circumstances for a lecture to be written and given. But it also, the more you read it now, the more you realize it was about confronting a broken world, a world that had lost magic, or really lost the ability to know what to do with magic. And it was a text where the man was pulling it all together again and preparing to go out into the world where he then made the Bilder Atlas. It's quite an extraordinary moment. And so the therapeutic component or healing component which was confronting you as a haunted house. It was the house of Binswanger, asylum of Binswanger. I'm curious if this is a theme more broadly for you, if you find the healing or therapeutic side of things present.
Yeah, definitely it's present, because I think, I mean, you asked me initially about the books, and I think books became really important because I basically, I had this accident when I was like 6, which I also talk about in the book. And then, I had a lot of time in a way. And I think that was 6, 7, the beginning of me sort of looking at books and spending time with books, because I was given books. And then I think the other thing which is related to that is, of course, the story of Emma Kunz. And many of you might not be familiar with Emma Kunz because she's unfortunately not yet as known as Hilma af Klint, who has now broken through into public consciousness, who also for a long time was forgotten. And like Hilma af Klint, Emma Kunz is this extraordinary, figure of spiritual abstraction. She was a Swiss healer who healed with a pendulum, and actually at a certain moment started to make these amazing drawings with a pendulum, which are really magical. It's very similar to Hilma af Klint. Just the fact that, I mean, Emma was self-taught. Hilma, of course, came out of an academic art tradition and then went into the spiritualist idea of abstraction. And with Emma, it really came out of the healing practice. And she discovered the healing quality of this stone. You can still buy today in every pharmacy, bigger pharmacy in Switzerland. It's called Ion. And it's an amazing, I mean, one can either drink it or take a bath in it, or one can also give it to the plants. It's great for the garden, plants really grow better with it. It's an amazing, radiating stone she discovered in a cave outside Zurich. And so for me, that sort of whole idea of, the healing art of Emma Kunz is a childhood, memory in a way in Switzerland. And I think, art had also always on me this kind of impact, but also, I mean, the other thing which I think I kind of realized only sort of retrospectively when I wrote the book was what really happened during these early studio visits. Because I went to studios, all over Europe, and I would basically go to 4 or 5 studios a day and then take the night train. And obviously the artist was slightly perplexed, that all of a sudden the 17-year-old teenager would be in their studio. And they all sort of gave me tasks. And I think that was, and I've actually, continued with many of these tasks until today. And that really was somehow a great revelation, because I was not really conscious of that before writing this book. So for example, language. So I went to see Pistoletto in Torino, and he said, it's really lovely that somebody so young has an interest in his work, but I should really go back to Switzerland and learn to speak proper Italian, and it could be better to come back. I did it, and then a year later came back and spoke Italian. Then we had the next experience was kind of with Rosemarie Trockel. That was another amazing experience, because Rosemarie Trockel, who is now this very well-known artist, she's now in Berlin. She was in Cologne at the time. So I was 16, 17, and she was 33. So she said, qualified as a young emerging artist. And she said, it's really great that I would visit young artists, something I've always done to kind of, support people at the beginning of their trajectory. But she said, you really have to understand that there are so many extraordinary artists from the past. And above all, she was mentioning all these female artists, who worked in the 60s and 70s and haven't had recognition. Like, it was just the beginning of Louise Bourgeois getting the attention she should have had a long time earlier.
Yeah.
But otherwise, many, many, many female artists didn't have attention. So she said, when you go to cities, ask the young artists you meet, who is the pioneer, who is the Louise Bourgeois in this city? I took a night train. I went from Cologne to Vienna, and I visited a young artist studio. Young artists, like, Erwin Wurm was there, and Alois Mosbach, as a group of younger artists. And I asked them, who is this pioneering artist you're inspired by? And they all said Maria Lasnik. And of course, at that time, nobody knew Maria Lasnik outside Austria and Germany. She wasn't well known. So I again, got her telephone number, I rang her up, and that was the beginning of a very long, in a way, dialogue, but also it's the beginning of a series of shows which goes until today. If at the Serpentine we do once a year an exhibition in a series, what we call Protest Against Forgetting. Most recently, Arpita Singh, who is an extraordinary artist from India in her late 80s, who has never had a museum show outside India, was a very urgent show to do. Kamala Ibrahim Ishaq, one of the most extraordinary painters from Africa, from Sudan, also in her late 80s. So again, I continued the task of Rosemarie Trockel. Then I went to see Boetti in Rome, and he said, you cannot become a boring curator. So I said, what do you mean? You know, it was rather harsh, you know, and so then he said, you know, curators always ask artists to kind of do stuff, you know, I'm asked to do this and do that. And nobody ever asks me what I really want to do. So that could be your job. You should listen to artists' unrealized projects, to artists' dreams, stuff artists want to do, which in the parameters of the art institutions, you know, cannot happen. And that's again, you know, something I've basically done ever since. Or a more recent task, I mean, that was rather haunting. About 12, 13 years ago, I went to see Umberto Eco in Milan, the great scholar,
great
novelist.
library.
Exactly. And I went to interview him. And the interview was kind of a pretext to see his library, because I really wanted to see his library. And so we did this interview for a book, and you know, and he showed me all these shelves, because for every book, he had done a research. He was working on a book, and for each book, a reading list, etc. But then he said there is a secret room he rarely shows, and I said, of course, I want to see it. So then he had this big key, and it was a bit like In the Name of the Rose. It was slightly uncanny. He opened the door, locked it behind himself, and then we were in this room with these, you know, goes back to my childhood, with these medieval codexes, the books he had corrected, mostly, you know, in handwriting. And he showed me all of this, and then we basically said goodbye as he opened the door. I was on the stairs, and he looked at me and he said, you have to save handwriting. I'm too old, but I'm going to give you this task now. You know, you need to save handwriting. Handwriting is disappearing. So I kind of was slightly dizzy and walked through the streets of Milan, and I thought, I'm really not competent to start a calligraphy school. But, you know, somehow I got a task. And then I was basically a few weeks later, I was in the studio of Reinhard Kartin, young artist, who was an early adopter of Instagram. And I mean, in a way, that project shows a bit my methodology. So it's very much about serendipity. And then Reinhard Kartin, you know, took my phone and he downloaded the app of Instagram, you know, on my smartphone, and he posted to all his followers. He was an early adopter, so he had already 10,000 followers. You know, at that time, that was a lot because very few people were on Instagram. And he posted a post to all his followers. Hans Ulrich has joined Instagram. So obviously there was peer pressure wherever I went. People said, what are you going to post? And I knew that I wouldn't want to post selfies. I wouldn't want to post food. I thought people would find that boring. I didn't want to post travel. So I kind of thought I need to kind of come up with something which has a mission and what is useful and all of that. But I still didn't, you know, so I had now two problems. I needed to save handwriting, and I needed to come with an idea for my Instagram. Then with my partner Kushanga, the artist, on winter vacation, Christmas vacation in Bretagne, in Brittany, in France. And then, you know, the weather is rather ghastly there sometimes. And so it was like raining, and we had to go to a cafe because the rain was so heavy we couldn't continue the walk. And then we were there like for 2 hours. And then after about 2 hours of intense conversation, the inevitable happened is that Simone Fatal, Etel's partner, my partner Kushanga, myself, we all went on our phone and started to answer a few emails and texts. And of course, Etel, the great poet and artist who is in her late 80s then, she did not have a smartphone. So she took out a little notebook and started to write a poem. And that's when all of a sudden it all came together. As Umberto Eco, Reinhard Kartin, I sort of took a photo, filmed her do the thing. And I thought I can just post on Instagram because I meet wonderful artists and poets every day. I can post this. And basically, and that's actually, again, related to another task which was given to me by the scholar and philosopher Wilhelm Flusser earlier on when I was a student, because he said, whenever you get a new device, you know, one of these devices, you need to use it in the opposite way of what the inventors want you to use it for. It's about disobedience. You know, use the camera in a way the inventors didn't want you. So I thought, you know, it's actually a double disobedience here, because first of all, of course, these devices are kind of responsible for maybe handwriting being less used, but also the app, actually Instagram, the founders never thought of it as an image sharing platform. They never thought it could be used for handwriting. So it was a kind of a double détournement.
You used Instagram to save handwriting.
Hopefully I made a small contribution.
I think you have. It's amazing. The other studio visit I wanted to ask about very quickly, because you say something quite extreme about it, is the Fischli Weiss, because you say that you were born or reborn in that studio visit. That's a big thing. So what was reborn, or what happened there that you found so formative?
Yeah, so the Swiss artists, Peter Fischli and David Weiss, who collaborated, Sadly, David Weiss passed away, so now Peter officially has a solo artistic practice, a wonderful solo artistic practice, but they worked all the time together. And they had an amazing exhibition in Basel I saw about equilibriums, and they were basically photographs of equilibria just on the brink of collapsing. And I called them, and the day I kind of went to the studio, they were actually beginning to work on this film, The Way Things Go, a film which has become very famous, which is a film of a seemingly endless chain reaction shot by the Swiss cinematographer, very well-known Swiss cinematographer, Pio Corradi. And it's basically one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. It's an infinite chain reaction. And I was in the studio and I basically saw this, magical chain reaction. And it's that day I kind of realized that that's what I want to do in life. I kind of want to work with artists and find a way to be useful to artists. I didn't yet know at the time that there is such a thing as a curator, but I kind of knew that that's, what I wanted to do. And Fischli Weiss became my mentors, and they basically, whenever I came back from a trip, I went to tell them what I've seen, and they questioned me why did I like it, what did I think, and they would also give me ideas of whom else I could go and visit in different cities. And then when I was 18, I made the driver's license, my father had this old Volvo, and then actually this amazing story happens because another very iconic work of Fischli Weiss, which you also might know, is the snowman. They created this extraordinary snowman. One can see it permanently installed in the Baylor Foundation in Basel, in Rien, and I think in several other parts of the world. It was also shown at MoMA. And it's basically a snowman which never melts. And it was done as a public artwork for the Kraftwerk in Saarbrücken, for a power plant. So it's not wasting any energy, because it's the excess energy of the power plant, which basically, and now at Baylor in Basel, where it's permanent, it's actually solar panels which keep that snowman alive. And Fischli Weiss, it's a bit like with architecture commission. When you have a public art commission, there's this frenzy of the deadline. When as an architect, you miss the deadline in a competition, then you lose the chances for the building to be built. And with public art, it's the same. So the deadline was the next morning at 10, and they had just finished the maquette, the afternoon before, and there was no way like a courier could deliver it. So they basically rang me and they said, could you take your father's Volvo and drive this snowman maquette to Saarbrücken? So, I drove to Zurich, and it was kind of really cute because they put the snowman on the seat, not the passenger seat. It's a safety belt. Everybody at customs was kind of suspicious. There's kind of something weird is going on here. In any case, I drove to Saarbrücken with the snowman on my side. It was a weird conversation. And I arrived in like at 7 in the morning here in Saarbrücken. And there was on the bridge of I tell the story in the book, there was on the bridge of this power plant stood, the great impresario Caspar Koenig, the most important art impresario of the 70s, 80s, 90s. He was an Ausstellungsmacher, an exhibition maker, made extraordinary large-scale exhibitions, and was somehow the person I always wanted to meet, because I had met so many artists, but I needed to meet somebody who could be my mentor to really learn on the job how to do a book, how to do an exhibition, and I sort of thought he would be the most amazing person to learn from. And so, I arrived there with the snowman, and I was super grateful that the snowman had arrived in time, and the snowman actually won then the competition, was built in Saarbrücken, and obviously that was the beginning of, so that's how I got my first job.
Incredible. Can I just ask a quick sideline on this issue of studios before we leave that topic, which you never have left? I mean, it's an extraordinary durational practice of your own. But I'm curious because it strikes me that in recent years, one of the curatorial moves has been to bring the studio into the exhibition. And in some ways, I'm thinking partly of the great reconstruction of Francis Bacon's studio in Dublin, which is an extreme example, but quite an amazing one. But then also increasingly within exhibitions, there was the Henry Moore one where it showed the stones and natural forms that he had on his table. The idea of bringing the studio into the show. What do you think about this trend or pattern?
Yeah, I think it's probably connected to the idea also that the exhibition can be, a laboratory.
Yeah.
That it's not just a site of,
do things,
finite, of sort of finished objects or final, or realized project, but it's a process. And I think, I mean, in a way, it's interesting how that idea can also lead to the fact that actually the exhibition can be about knowledge production. And I think that's definitely something which plays a big role in my work and curatorial work. We did an exhibition once in '99 in Antwerp, and I always thought it's actually one of my favorite shows, and it never traveled, so it's actually a little bit forgotten, because there was an exhibition in Antwerp of Van Dyck, and the mayor of Antwerp said, as the Van Dyck exhibition is the blockbuster, we want another exhibition where we want, young people to experiment. It was in 1999. So they basically gave us a really good budget to experiment. And we did with my colleague Barbara van der Linden, we did this show called Laboratorium. So we wanted to kind of analyze what is the laboratory of the scientist and what is the studio of the artist. And so we basically created open studio days, so people could visit the studios in Antwerp. We created open lab days, because it's really interesting. I mean, even if you look at the city like London, in every city, we really don't know so much where in the city the scientific labs are. And very often, we don't visit them. And obviously, having visited lots of studios, at a certain moment, I started to do the same with writers. I started to do the same with architects, and then also with scientists. I would visit studios of different practitioners. So we wanted to do this show about, and also, of course, it was about it was the moment also at the very beginning of the 90s, very end of the 90s, very beginning of the 2000s. So we wanted to see also how the internet changes, how it becomes a network condition. So we worked with Bruno Latour, his whole actor network idea. And Bruno Latour didn't really understand when I went to see him, because he says, I'm writing books. You kind of got the wrong guy, I'm not doing exhibitions here. So then I explained to him that we wanted the exhibition to be a knowledge production process. And so he actually agreed to participate. He invited the amazing philosophers Isabel Stengers, she is in Brussels, and historian of science. He invited Peter Geddes and Caroline Jones. And we recommended Panamarenko, Rem Koolhaas, to all do experiments in public. So the idea, how an experiment happens in a lab, in a studio, but can you actually do it in front of an audience? Could we now on stage do an experiment we actually would normally do in a protected studio? So Latour liked this tabletop experiment series so much that he then went on to curate shows at the ZKM, for many, many years. And the exhibition was fascinating because you had, for example, also Panamarenko, who said the studio should not be accessed by anyone. So we had on the map a non-accessible studio, because the artist doesn't welcome anyone.
Of course.
And it became this huge network. The city became, in a way, the laboratorium city. And so that was really the moment we addressed, that. Ajit R. Laboratoire from Dakar came, this amazing artist collective, and they transported their laboratory from Dakar into Antwerp. And of course, it also means that it becomes, and I think there is a great interest also of the public to understand how the artistic process works, how creation works.
Exactly. There are many of your projects that I wish we could have done here. Can we do that one here? Because Warburg called his library a laboratorium. It was all about the library as a place of experiment. And of course, we've got UCL and all of the scientific powerhouses all around us, but we need to bring that to our shop window here. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
As someone once said.
And also we have the archive. The archive is actually archived at ZKM.
Incredible.
Because there is all the videos of Bruno Latour.
Okay, we have witnesses. So he just agreed to do it. So we're going to do it. The other experimental exhibition that you mentioned that I wonder if you could say just a little bit about, because it's so extraordinary, is the Walser, the Robert Walser project you did. And I was thinking, you've already, I think, given us a sense of how important mobility and portability, movement, again, another great Warburgian subject, but portability and mobility are so important. But now marry that with experiment, and you have this amazing portable museum on the move, you called it, right?
Yeah, I was always excited that we could have, portable museums. So I also had a nano museum, which is basically a little frame from the shop of Hans-Peter Fellmann, 2 by 3 inches. And in the 90s, I would always carry it with me and show it to whomever I met. If I was on a bus, I would show it to the people on the bus, or on a train, or all of that. And So that was the portable museum. And then basically the idea of Robert Walser, I mean, I kind of grew up with Robert Walser in Switzerland. And of course, in the eastern part of Switzerland, where I studied in St. Gallen, Walser went on these famous walks because he initially lived in Switzerland. He went to exile to Berlin, where his brother was a well-known visual artist. Then he went to a fictitious exile in Paris, an imaginary exile, and then to an inner exile back to Switzerland. And he, like, you know, Warburg was actually, the last couple of years he was in a clinic in Switzerland, and ultimately stopped writing because he said walking is his form of writing. And one of my favorite books in the world is Carl Selig. For those of you who haven't read it, it's an incredible book because Carl Selig documented the walks with Robert Walser. It's been translated in English. It's called Walks with Robert Walser. And my museum was basically an homage to Walser and to this book, because in the book you see that they're always on these endless walks with Walser, which Selig documented. They basically went to the same restaurant, Krone in Geis, city where today the painter Albert Oehlen lives, in the pre-Alps. And so we installed a vitrine in this restaurant, and basically would every month invite an artist to do an homage to Robert Walser, whilst the restaurant continued to function. So in a way, it was, you know, a form of infiltration. Some people came for Robert Walser. Many people just came to have a food there or drinks or whatever. And this idea, you know, of doing exhibitions in unexpected contexts, you know, it's basically, and I mean, in a way that we carry exhibitions into the world so that people, and it's also
right behind us.
Yeah, because I mean, with the Serpentine Pavilion, I mean, the other day I came back from a trip and then like super early in the morning, I went directly to the office. So obviously the taxi driver thought I must work there because nobody would go at 7 a.m. to the Serpentine. So then he said that if I'm working there, I said yes. And he said that he always wanted to tell a story to someone who works at the Serpentine. So I said, I'm very happy to listen to it. So he told me the story of his daughter, that they came like on a walk on a Sunday, and all of a sudden the daughter ran into the pavilion. And he said it's very unusual that, because she usually, you know, they would never go to museums, and he told his kids that museums are not for us and all of that. But suddenly, because there are no doors, you know, you see the pavilion of Marina Tabassum here, it can actually move, you know, it's a pavilion on the move, but it's always open. And so the daughter, it was a previous pavilion, but they're always open, they never have doors, she just ran in. And he wanted to tell us the story that she now, you know, the daughter now becomes an architect, and it was a transformative experience. And I think that idea, you know, that it's the same with the restaurant. We bring a Robert Walser museum to the restaurant, and so many people who would never see contemporary art would encounter it. And then the other thing which I thought is always very exciting is when you bring art into a context which is unexpected, the artists do very different works than they would do in a white cube. So, you know, for a small vitrine in a restaurant, they would do a different work than if they would exhibit in a big white space. So for example, after the Robert Walser Museum, and there's a whole other thing in the Robert Walser Museum which continues to also preoccupy me, which is of course the idea how to exhibit literature. You know, I've always been very interested, you know, because after having thought a lot about how to exhibit art, how to exhibit science with Laboratorium, how to exhibit architecture, the pavilions are an example, how to exhibit music, how to create sonic spaces. We are doing one right now. We're installing this afternoon with Peter Doig. We hope you can all come and see it. It opens next week. It's basically a show of Peter Doig and sound systems and music, where we bring sound and painting in Peter Doig's work together. So after, you know, thinking a lot about how to exhibit music, which I've been doing for a long time, I've always been thinking, you know, how could one exhibit literature? And we found different ways of doing it. With Adam Thirlwell, you know, we did Studio Creole with the novelist, where we basically had always that was a performative exhibition of literature. We always had the writer and the translator on stage at the same time. And so you could switch. You could either listen to the original language or to a translation you understand. And many people actually wanted to listen to a language they don't understand, to celebrate multilingualism. And I will never forget, we had the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of my favorite writers of the 21st century, who now passed away. We had Ngugi for several days in Manchester here, and he was on stage in Kyoku reading in this amazing language. We had the translator there, and it was an amazing celebration, you know. And that's, of course, very inspired by Edouard Glissant, for whom I've also kind of created, similarly to Robert Walser, a type of museum. So this sort of question of how to exhibit literature and then to exhibit in unexpected locations. So after the Walser Museum, I moved to Paris, and I couldn't find an apartment. So I rented a hotel room in a rather shabby, you know, modest, small hotel. And it was a hotel where many artists lived. and Raymond Hans lived there, and Gloria Friedman, and Bertrand Lavier. And I sort of had this memory from Switzerland and this experience of having done a show in my kitchen, because I had also done an exhibition in my kitchen, which lasted for 3 months and had 29 visitors and became a rumor. And then, you know, and then of course the Robert Walser Museum. So I did the same in Paris. I basically started to think, you know, I could actually invite artists to do artworks in my hotel room. So the hotel was very confused because they thought, you know, this person has a lot of guests, because like basically every day another person came to my room, you know, and obviously these were these artists installing artworks. And I had told the hotel that there are going to be some things on the walls, they shouldn't remove them. So they told the staff to not remove anything. And after about a month, the hotel was full with 70, the hotel room was full with 72 artworks. Some went into the corridors. And I told the hotel sort of that there might be now a few more visitors. And I had told them that I had done a kitchen show, you know, in Switzerland, but they shouldn't worry, you know, because the kitchen show had only 29 visitors. They said, that's going to be fine, 29 visitors. But I had underestimated that this wasn't St. Gallen, this was Paris. And then like the first week, you know, there was Le Monde and Figaro and also, and actually Libération, you know, the huge articles. And within a fortnight, you know, there were queues and hundreds of people came to the hotel, but it was too late to stop it. So, and again, you know, it was an unexpected context. And a great way to arrive in Paris, in a way.
Oh my God. All right. I think I only have time for 2 more quick things. I did want to talk more about Edouard Glissant, because I didn't realize quite how deep that goes for you, but we'll have to leave that for another conversation. For those of you who don't know the work, it's absolutely crucial for the way Hans Ulrich's work has sort of decentered world art paradigms. Really, really, really crucial. But I want to ask something that may sound almost like perversely the opposite, which is about England and English. I didn't somehow quite realize that this was then translated into English. I was going to ask you what it was like to write it in English, but you already answered saying that you didn't. Now, I asked this because last week we had a very special event here, which marked the 75th anniversary of the publication of Gombrich, The Story of Art. Ernst Gombrich, as many of you will know, was the director here for many, many years, worked in this institution from 1936 to 2001, so a nice long run. He also wrote the book that became the best-selling book on art ever written in this institution. But what's always amazed me is that it was his first work in English. And he nailed it. He somehow got accessible communication from the start by working in a new language. And he talked about that later in his extremely thick Austrian accent, which never left him, and said it would not have been a good book in German had he written it in German. And so you don't dwell on that question here. You do talk about the multilingualism at the beginning, which is a passport in many ways. But I'm curious, because you've spent so much time here now. How do you feel about English and working in this language?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question, because actually most of my texts are now written in English, and it's the main language in which I write. But it was really very strange that for this more autobiographical book, it didn't work in English, and it didn't work. I cannot explain it why. It just somehow worked in French.
It's really interesting. I mean, maybe it will take some time. And again, we did a really great dialogue a few years back now with Jhumpa Lahiri, the great writer who has, of course, famously chosen to only write in a foreign language, in Italian, which she didn't know when she started writing, having won the Pulitzer Prize in English for her own first book. So interesting story there. But the last question I wanted to ask goes to your last question that you always ask everyone, which I now have learned you actually got from Boetti. The question about the what's your unrealized project? Don't ask me always about what I've already done. Ask me about my unrealized project. And in a way, it takes us to the heart of what's unusual about writing a memoir. It's called Life in Progress. And of course, our hope is that you have much life ahead. You know, you're writing a biography, a life story, when you're still in full flow. And I think it's always an unusual challenge. And I wonder first if you thought about that, but my version of your question of unrealized projects is, when you write volume 2, what chapters will it have? What would you like it to cover?
No, thank you. And actually, before answering that, I might now kind of maybe have an answer to your previous question. I've just been thinking. I think somehow the reason it's not written in German is that I just haven't been living in, or basically in German language, and that it was always anyway a foreign language, because, when you're Swiss, and you grow up with Swiss German, German is a foreign language.
Yeah.
And then I have not written, in German in such a long time. So the book could only have been written in either French or English, because that's in a way how I write. And then in a way, maybe it is in French, because a majority of this book is really about all these kind of early experiments. It's about the hotel exhibition in Paris. It's about the work at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. It's about Laboratorium, about Cities on the Move. It's about all these shows I did during the 15 years where I lived in France. And I think it has somehow to do with this memory.
Yeah.
And then probably the next volume or the next book that
will be written in English.
Will most likely be written in English. It maybe has to do with that. And
so
maybe that could be an answer, but I'm not yet sure if it's the right answer. But then the second thing about the unrealized project, I mean, it's a bit like with curators, it's a bit like with architects. There are long lists of exhibitions which have fallen through, of unrealized projects, and but I think in a way, as your question is slightly different, it's more about what I want to do in the future and what will be these future projects I would actually realize in a way, which of these unrealized projects we realize. I think one of the most exciting thing is certainly, I mean, to continue certain things which are happening now. I mean, which I wanted also to have this image here, I'm extremely excited, for example, about what's happening, in architecture right now, where you have this amazing new generation of architects, which we've been featuring now, I would say, in the last 10, 12 years. The pavilion started initially with, of course, Zaha did the first one. It started with amazing legendary architects who have been built in the UK. And then after Su Fujimoto, there was the thing when I was invited to the Venice Architecture Biennale by Sejima to basically talk to all her architects and do a room, like a portraiture of an exhibition. I met many, many younger architects. And we suddenly realized, now that the scheme is so well known, we can actually use this as a platform to really create visibility for a younger generation of architects. And they usually immediately after doing this pavilion, they start to build in many different kind of commissions. And I just think it's a very exciting moment where the architecture world becomes more polyphonic, more diverse, where you have many, many more female architects. I mean, these amazing voices like Marina Tabassum, Sumaya Valley, Lina Gottme, Frida Escobedo, with whom we've been in the last couple of years. So the idea for projects like this to continue, hopefully for many years, so there is a continuation. Then there is, of course, projects which are not yet, in a way, completely started, but which definitely are going to become important. I mean, I've always said that at some point it will be important to invent or think about an art school for the 21st century, an interdisciplinary school. And it's a bit too simplist to refer to the Black Mountain College, because that's one model. There are many more. But what, of course, the Black Mountain College has is this interdisciplinarity. You had scientists there, collaborators of Einstein, you had Cage there, you had basically, and I spoke to Suzanne Weil, and I spoke to also Dorothea Rockburn, who both studied there. And just this idea that you would have an art school where, the humanities and art and science wouldn't be separated is something I always thought, and particularly now, would be very important. We actually started to think about that right now, participating in this project, which is connected to San Francisco, but it's the San Francisco Art Institute, which stopped because there was basically a bankruptcy of the school, and then there was a risk that it would become a real estate project, and Marine Power Jobs actually saved that building, and then it's now becoming maybe such a school, and we are actually doing sort of listening sessions about that to a lot of artists, what they think such an art school should be. And I think there should be many such schools on every continent and everywhere. And that's definitely something which I think will play a role if we think about in the next, 10 years. Then I think the other thing which is very important is what's going to happen with the archive. Because I think the question is, and I'm here at the Warburg, and so I wanted to talk about the archive. And I mean, I have about 4,000 hours of conversations with artists, which are mostly digital, and I mean, kind of all are digital, and about half of them are film. No, and that's thanks to Jonas Mekas, because when I started my trajectory, Jonas, we sat in a cafe in Paris, and he looked at me. He was all the time on his camera, the old-fashioned kind of Rolex camera, and he was basically filming, and he said, you should film because one day you will regret not to have a documentation of all your encounters. And so I've actually, again, an artist gave me a task, we're back to that. And so I've done that, and obviously it will be interesting, I think, in the years to come, what's happening with the archive. We began with that. Maya Hoffman started this amazing institution in Arles called Luma, which is basically it's an interdisciplinary art institution, art center, where she connects, art, society, ecology, and there is, with Atelier Luma, also a very strong design component, sustainability component, and parts of basically every year there is an archive exhibition there out of my archive. So it's the beginning of that. So we've done a show on Edouard Glissant, on Ete Latnan, on Agnès Varda, on Gustav Metzger. This year is Maria Lasnik. So it's basically pioneering artists, and we show all the video interviews from the archive, and that's just the beginning, of actually working with these archives. So I would say that's going to become kind of probably a big chapter, in a future book. How can we invent the future with these fragments, in a way, from the past? Then there is, of course, also the unrealized project, of the Fun Palace of Cedric Price, and the Institute of Glissant, because I think there is two unrealized art institutions which are never built, which I think should be built. Which I hope we one day can build. One is actually deeply connected to London. It's the great Cedric Price and the great John Littlewood as a street theater pioneer and an architect pioneer. They wanted to create this art institution in East London, and we actually tried with Kunle Adeyemi. There was a kind of a prefiguration of the shed with Alex Poots, and we tried also with Tempo del Postino in Manchester, in the collaboration with the Manchester Theatre Festival, to make such Fun Palace sketches, So for example, we had Kunle Adeyemi do a structure, and you could have there a dance performance, and then it would transition into a rap concert, and then transition into a panel discussion, an academic panel discussion. And that was the idea of this Fun Palace. It's a completely a place where you would have fast lanes and slow lanes. And of course, Glissant's Institute, again, we don't have the time to go into details about that, but the Martinican theoretician Edouard Glissant wanted to, not only, he actually built a school, an amazing school where the language was Creole in Martinique, which formed generations of people like Chamazo, but he also wanted to create an art institution where all the cultures, all the world's culture would be brought together. And which would basically be a laboratory, and that has also never happened. So maybe the construction or the realization, of course, not exactly of what they had conceived, but of this kind of idea reservoir. And then, of course, technology. I mean, the book ends very abruptly.
It does.
Sorry, the answer is so long because I've really got a long list of things which will be in the next book. There's also technology. I mean, I was kind of inspired by Werner Herzog because he wrote an autobiography which ends in, I don't know if you saw that, but it's really exciting. His autobiography ends in the middle of the sentence. And I recommend this book very vividly because I mean, Herzog always says that he actually thinks that maybe his written books and his writing will one day be remembered more than his films. He really is an amazing writer. So and I don't end it in the middle of the sentence, but it ends quite abruptly.
It does.
As several readers told me, they thought it was an abrupt end. And of course it ends on technology. And in a way, on this idea of what art can do with AI. How, I mean, it's this whole idea of Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, where they basically created as artists a choir situation with AI, because of course group singing has been, Carlos' response has been a ritual, for mass communication. And they kind of connect that to AI and think, how can we actually ethically, create a data set? So they worked with choirs, created a data trust, which is co-owned with the choirs. created also a data set where you can, as a viewer, experience it. So that's an experiment, and it's been now quoted, the EU quoted it. They didn't even know that it's an artwork.
Yeah.
So we see here how actually all of a sudden we can find new ways, to actually work with technology. And I think this idea of new experiments with art and technology will obviously, play a very major role in our future books.
That is the most amazing answer to any question I think I've ever asked. Because not only do I want to read this book, and I will make sure I live long enough, but I want to help you write it. I want to be part of it. So thank you, as always, for an incredibly wide-ranging and inspiring presentation. And again, just your friendship for the Institute's much appreciated. But also,
thank you so much. And I actually had a question for you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what are your unrealized projects?
Oh, see, I told you, you never get away without this question. My unrealized projects are all of the ones you just mentioned. I mean, it's uncanny. I think of all of them, the archive is the one that I personally am most involved in and resonates most strongly. But I did actually have a question that I didn't ask you. So I'm going to go back again to you. About how to take the analog archive. We have one of the great archives in the world here with A.B. Warburg's entire Nachlass, his entire working papers, extraordinary hundreds of boxes of notes. I mean, it's like you before you. It's amazing, but it's not in touch with the world of the digital. And in many ways, he anticipates artificial intelligence. He anticipates all kinds of machine learning processes. And so for me, I think figuring out how to square in a really deep way, in a way that does justice backwards as well as forwards, to marrying the analog and the best of the new digital. This is something I really feel we've only started to figure out.